with us our old buddy Cole Stangler, the journalist based in Marseille, France, contributor to The Nation, Jacobin, France 24, the International News Network, and he has a new book out, Paris is Not Dead, Surviving Hyper-Gentrification in the City of Light. ColeStangler.com, ColeStangler.com is the website, and it's also the Twitter handle. Cole, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we talked, and I love your book. First of all,
it has. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Tell us what provoked you to write this book.
Yeah, I was living in the north of Paris and in the 18th arrondissement and in the north of the city, and I was interested in kind of the richness, diversity of the place that I was living in, and I think, without wanting to badmouth, too many journalistic colleagues, I was kind of struck by the gap between the Paris that I think gets portrayed so much nationally and internationally, certainly, and then the actual Paris that I was living in, this vibrant working class neighborhood in the north. So seeing kind of that gap, I think, made me want to write in certain ways a kind of reported celebration, in many respects of this neighborhood. But that's part of it. And I think also seeing, the fact that it's alluded to in the title, or partially in the title of the book, the fact that there's tremendous gentrification, that this part of the city that's so great is also unfortunately fading. But the battle isn't quite over. So I'm trying to kind of capture these two things. It's a celebration of what still exists, but it's also kind of a warning of the fact that this part of the city is fading.
I think most Americans are familiar with the word gentrification. I'm not sure all of them understand exactly what it means or how it plays out. Can you describe what you mean when you talk about hyper-gentrification in the subtitle of your book, and how it might be different the way it's playing out in Paris than the way it might play out in New York or in Boise?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I use the word gentrification, I'm talking about an economic process that I think there are really two fundamental kind of manifestations of this process. One is rent hikes, so significant rent hikes taking place in urban areas, and the second part of that is displacement. So you have people that are being forced to leave, and you have this process that can completely transform urban areas. We've seen it in so many cities in the United States. I'm from the Northeast. I think about a place like New York City that has just been changed so much from the city that I knew when I was growing up there, or when I grew up around there, excuse me, or San Francisco. You have a lot of these cases in the United States of these cities that have been just completely transformed, low income, working class people having to leave. And that changes the character of cities. And in a lot of ways, it's tragic to see the kind of identity being sucked out of these places because normal people, ordinary people, can't afford to live in them. So that's the process. Paris, I use the word hyper-gentrification because it's already a city that has a lot of wealth in it. We're not talking about neighborhoods that are very, very poor. We're talking about neighborhoods that are, where ordinary people can still afford to live, that have, some amount of wealth in them. But I think we've seen so many waves of this play out and I think we're kind of at a very advanced stage in the city of Paris. One other kind of very specific thing about Paris is that the city is already very, very dense. And so it means that one of the solutions, people talk about for dealing with housing is often to build more housing. That's part of it, increasing supply, but that can be quite hard to do in a place like Paris where the city is already tremendously dense. So that's just kind of one important aspect I would underline.
I reading in your book, you were talking about how you can still find an apartment, at least in this part of Paris where you were living, for 500, 600, 700 euros a month, but it's going to be a disaster. It's going to have a bathroom down the hall, or it's going to open onto a busy street, or you'll have to deal with rats crawling all over you. How bad is it? I mean, how bad has the situation become, and to what extent have the working class been driven out of Paris and its suburbs?
Yeah, the rent hikes have, I think since the year 2000, roughly, have gone up. Housing costs have increased 3 times since the year 2000. Wow. You have over
3 times or 300%.
200%. Wow. So you have more than 10,000 people that have been leaving the city every year, according to the official data. And as you mentioned, yes, so these neighborhoods, people are living in, kind of cramped spaces to be able to hold on. But I think, in some ways, I didn't want to, the book is kind of trying to raise the alarm in some respects in the Anglophone world, but it's also trying to celebrate these neighborhoods for what they are. And, these are tremendously diverse places. I think that's something that can often be forgotten about in outside of France, just how multicultural and diverse of a city Paris is, and really France is as a country. And so, the places that I'm talking about in the book, have large shares of immigrant population from West Africa, from North Africa, from China, from India. We don't often think about, Paris as being this sort of melting pot, but it is in a lot of respects. And that's because of historically, there's been affordable housing in the city. And that, I'm trying to kind of also show when you take that away out of the equation, it means that you have a, negative impact on the character of the city. And I think, just another aspect to highlight when we're talking about, why these neighborhoods have persisted over the years. Right now, there's one really key, many key elements, but I think one above all that I want to highlight, and that is we have something called social housing in France. So that's state managed, state regulated housing at below market rates. And if you look at these neighborhoods where the working class still lives, you have pretty high shares of social housing. That's one of the really important policy tools that's quite effective that we don't have, unfortunately, in the United States.
How would we do that in the United States? How would that lesson from Paris translate into a city in America?
Yeah, I think, there are a few kind of policy measures. So social housing is a big one. It's interesting. I think the conversation is shifting a little bit. It seems like, although I'm obviously not on the ground in the U.S., but there seems to be an acknowledgement that maybe we should be turning more to these kind of solutions we have in Europe for dealing with housing, social housing being one of them. I think Seattle just, if I'm not mistaken, a couple of years ago, passed a referendum that created a social housing agency to start experimenting with this. Because, if there's one thing, again, I'm repeating myself, but I think it's so important to emphasize for American audiences. In the U.S., we often talk about just, the YIMBYs versus the NIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard, not in my backyard. I'm simplifying, but oftentimes the debate can kind of be, simplified into this, do you want more supply? Do you not want more supply? And, obviously that's part of the equation, but, it depends who owns the housing, who owns that supply. Social housing is the government stepping into the market and saying we're going to build housing or manage the housing and regulate the price. So social housing is so key. And then rent controls are another tool that we do see in the United States to some extent. In Paris, they're experimenting with them again now after a long break of not having rent controls. That's a very, it's an important tool as well. It's not a magic silver bullet, but I think, let's look at how Europeans regulate housing to think about, how can we deal with some of these problems that we have in the United States. I hope that's one of the takeaways, at least of how
does social housing differ from what we refer to in America as the projects?
Yeah, well, I think one big difference is that you've had just a lot more government funding of social housing. It's been recognized as a kind of important policy tool, and it's not reserved for only the least well off in France. It's not reserved for just the lowest income bracket. People who are lower to middle income, even to middle income, have the right to have social housing. And it's actually even a source of debate in Paris, where people are saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be allowing so many middle class people access to social housing. So, you do have this tradition of having so good funding for the program, quality housing stock too. That's such an important point. If you look at the social housing that's being built in Paris today, these are nice looking places. They're enjoyable places to live, and I got to tour a few of them for reporting. And then, it's a question of political will too. It's been a priority. This has been a priority to fund this and to use it as a tool to combat the housing crisis in Europe. And I think, that we're starting to maybe think that way a little bit in the U.S., but maybe not there yet. Yeah, it sounds fascinating. The book is remarkable. Paris is Not Dead: Surviving Hyper-Gentrification in the City of Light by Cole Stangler, the new book. And Cole, thanks so much for dropping by.